Hey guys, let's go ahead and start talking about the Revolutionary period in the United States. Salutary neglect is this idea that leaving the colonies to run themselves would actually be more profitable and it would cause less problems. If you just leave everybody alone, then they'll make you money and they might break the law a little bit, but ultimately it works out in everybody's favor. Now, the problem with this is now the British want the colonists to pay for the French Indian War debts. And so one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to end salutary neglect and they're going to start enforcing acts and laws that have been put into place and just not enforced for a really long time. So Grenville is going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. These were originally intended to ensure that the colonies were making money for the crown. There's a lot of smuggling and there's a lot of kind of shady dealings going on in the colonies that the British are pretty well aware of. And so they try to put a stop to it in order to collect money that they weren't collecting. They're also going to use something called writs of assistance to help reduce smuggling and enforce the Navigation Acts. These writs of assistance are kind of like search warrants, basically. But whereas today, for a search warrant, you have to have probable cause. There is no probable cause. These can just be used by the British pretty much anywhere that they want. And this is actually going to start a lot of the problems. You're going to start to hear people agitating for no taxation without representation. So let's look at a timeline of some of the major events and actions that happened during the Revolutionary period. Now, something that I want you to see here is there are a series of British actions, a bunch of legislation, things that are done to the colonies. And you're going to have a couple of colonial reactions, one or two big reactions to each of those. And so it's going to be kind of a back and forth, almost like a tug of war for who is going to come out on top, who is going to take control. So 1764 is going to start with Sugar Acts. 1765, you'll see the Stamp Act. After that, a little while later, in 1767, because there's a lot of upheaval around the Stamp Act, you're going to see the passage of the Townshend Acts. Again, you'll see a little bit of a gap between the Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre, and a period of relative peace between the Boston Massacre and the Tea Act. After the Tea Act, things start to go downhill pretty quickly, and you're going to see the passage of the Intolerable Acts. So let's talk about all of these things and the colonial reactions to them in a little bit more context. So the Sugar Acts were the first acts that were passed specifically to make money by the crown. And it's a modified version of something that already existed, the Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733. So we passed these new Sugar Acts so that this tax that hadn't been collected for a really long time can be collected. It taxed sugar and all of its byproducts technically at a lesser rate than before. But since colonists hadn't been paying those taxes before, they're going to be really angry about what they're asked to pay with these Sugar Acts. And it wasn't even just sugar. Yes, sugar was important in the colonies, but it wasn't something that you absolutely needed, and it wasn't something that everybody necessarily used. One of the biggest issues that's going to arise from the Sugar Acts is a byproduct of sugar, which is molasses. Now, not a whole lot of people use molasses, but molasses can be turned into rum. And rum was actually really, really significant in colonial America. Believe it or not, it was used as currency a lot of the time. And you're going to see this importance of liquor a lot throughout the early American period. So people are mad about these Sugar Acts. They're going to beef up security, they're going to enforce the tax collection, and it causes an almost immediate steep decline in the rum industry in particular. And so now people are starting to get mad. Now, not everybody, though. Not everybody is mad because not everybody needs sugar. This isn't something that you absolutely have to pay, right? So let's go on and look at the Stamp Act and see how that differs from the Sugar Acts. Now remember, the Sugar Acts make people mad, but it's the Stamp Act that we're really going to see start to get people to coalesce and get really angry. So the Stamp Act is passed to support new forces in the colonies, and it's applied to all published and written materials. The thing about the Stamp Act is it's not stamps like we think of them. It's not stamps just for stuff that you mail. It is an unavoidable tax. If you have a child, you need a birth certificate. If somebody dies, you need a death certificate. If you have a house, you need a deed. People at this point in time, they don't have the internet or anything. So if you want to know what's going on in the world, you need a newspaper. Even just to have some sort of recreation, if you want playing cards, you need a stamp for those. You need a stamp for all of this stuff. And so people are going to be really, really, really mad about it. You guys, big mad. There's actually only one colony that's ever going to sell any of these stamps because there's so much of a boycott, and that colony is actually Georgia. So there are a couple of big reactions to the Stamp Act. The first one is the Virginia Resolves. Now, 5 out of 7 of these are passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses. They're written by Patrick Henry. You guys might remember him as the "Give me liberty or give me death" guy, if you guys have ever heard that quote. So Patrick Henry, kind of an extra individual. A lot of what he writes in the Virginia Resolve, specifically in the 2 of the 7 resolves that weren't passed by the House of Burgesses, were kind of borderline treason. So he goes hard in these Virginia Resolves. And one of the big things that he's going to pass in this is the non-importation agreements. And so Virginia is going to say, until the Stamp Act is repealed, we are not importing anything from Great Britain. That is going to be taken a step further with a big meeting, because Europeans and Americans love their meetings. So we're going to have 3 major meetings during this time period. Now remember, before with the French Indian War, we talked about the Albany Congress. So we're going to have some congresses, basically meetings. So the Stamp Act Congress is going to be 9 out of the 13 colonies. So a few guys don't show up, but they're going to meet to discuss their issues with the Stamp Act. They're going to write the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which among other things is going to distinguish between 2 terms: legislation and taxation. All right, so the difference between legislation and taxation, the big difference: legislation is okay, taxation is not okay. That's pretty much all you need to understand as far as the difference between these. But legislation is going to be used to regulate the empire. Taxation is just making money. So they're going to say that taxation is something that requires representation and that people in the colonies are not being represented. Now, after we send this declaration over, and now this declaration is the first in a series. I'm assuming you guys have heard of the Declaration of Independence. There's going to be a couple of these. Pretty much every meeting that we have, we're going to declare something. So this Declaration of Rights and Grievances is going to be responded to by our good friend George Grenville, with the idea that the colonies were actually represented by their British counterparts who voted for Parliament. The colonists are going to kind of say, no, thank you. They don't know what we're thinking. They don't understand us. They're not really our counterparts. But what you're going to see as a result of all this is the formation of a group called the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a radical group founded by our good friend Sam Adams. Now, Sam Adams is going to appear pretty much anywhere that the pot is being stirred. He is a drama queen, you guys. Sam Adams is absolutely everywhere that something is happening, and he is making sure that everybody is mad. And so he starts the Sons of Liberty to violently oppose the Stamp Act. They do things like tar and feather people, which sounds a lot less terrible than it actually is. Like it kind of sounds like you get tarred, so you get really, really sticky, and then they feather you, and then like later you take a weird bath, but everything's okay. But you got to remember, for tar to get sticky, it has to be really, 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 really hot. And we don't have things like antibiotics to treat burns at this point in time. And even if we did, third-degree burns with tar being poured on you is not comfortable at all, right? So they do things like that. They're also going to burn Stamp Act agents in effigy, which is basically just kind of making a dummy of the Stamp Act agent and being like, and burning it, hanging it, and saying, this could be you next, which is really scary. Like if you guys did that to me, I would probably be like, okay, well, I'm not going to come to work because it's not worth that, right? So ultimately, all of these Stamp Act agents are going to resign. Eventually, because of the Stamp Act agents resigning, because of the kind of back and forth, the Stamp Act is going to be repealed. Now, when Britain repeals this, they are also going to pass something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act says essentially that Britain can pass whatever laws it wants. Now remember, the Stamp Act Congress had differentiated between legislation and taxation. And so essentially the Declaratory Act says we can tax you in any way we see fit, whether it's legislation or taxation. They kind of blow a raspberry at the colonists, but they also don't try them with the Townshend Acts, right? Because they could very well have passed the Declaratory Act and then passed something that was very much taxation. But instead, they're going to pass something that is technically legislation. But we'll see what the problem with that is in a second. Now, the Townshend Acts, basically they place a small import duty on glass, lead, stuff like that, stuff that people need to buy. So it's going to tax you just a little bit for anything that you buy. And these acts were technically legislation. They served to regulate the British Empire. Now remember, legislation is all about regulating the empire, making sure that things work smoothly, and not all about making money, even if money is made as a result. The colonists, though, are going to call BS on the Townshend Acts because they realize that these Townshend Acts really are designed to make money. And so you're going to see a couple of different things. One is this guy named John Dickinson. He's going to write something called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And in it, he suggests that the Townshend Acts were just taxation dressed to look like legislation. He says in this, it is nothing but the addition of a former book with a new title page, and it will be attended with the very same consequence to American liberty. So like if you guys have ever had to pay for a textbook, here's a good story. So I had to pay for my textbooks when I was at Middle Georgia State, and I had to take Spanish, right? So I had to take 2 years of Spanish. And when I did this, I went and I got my Spanish book, and the Spanish book was ridiculously expensive. You guys, super, super expensive. And so I went to the bookstore and I was like, this is like 3 times what I normally pay for a book. And the guy at the bookstore was like, well, yeah, but you can also use the same textbook for all 4 semesters that you need of Spanish. So really, even though it's like 3 times what you normally pay, you're kind of saving. And I was like, okay, I mean, not like I have a choice in what I buy, but like, okay, sell it to me. Well, then a year later, I go back to the bookstore and I'm going and I'm getting my books, and they look at my schedule and they're like, you need a Spanish book. I was like, no, no, no. I've taken a year of Spanish already. I already have my Spanish book. I already purchased that monstrosity. And they're like, well, there's a different edition of this book now, and so you have to have it. And I'm just sitting there like, did Spanish change in some way that I am as yet unaware? But in order to take the class, I had to have this specific book. Couldn't have the other edition that I already had. So I buy this new Spanish book and I go home and I compare it to what is now a very expensive paperweight. And literally the only difference, you guys, was there was an introduction, a preface that was written by some guy who was like, this is a really great Spanish book. And so everything in my Spanish book was just 1 page farther than it had been. I was so mad. And that's kind of how these people felt during this time period. They're like, this is just the same thing. You dressed it up to look different, but that doesn't mean that it's different. And so letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania are going to take hold. A bunch of people are going to read them. And so Sam Adams, remember, he is everywhere that stuff's going down. And James Otis, who is the guy who came up with the phrase, no taxation without representation, they're going to come together and they're going to write the Massachusetts Circular Letter. And they argue in it that the Townshend Acts were unconstitutional because the colonists lacked representation in Parliament. And so we have to go back to this whole concept that Grenville had come up with of virtual representation, and they have to defend the idea that virtual representation is not a thing. They talk about how all of the people in Britain are separated by, like 1,000 leagues or something like that. Like they're separated by this huge ocean. And they even go as far as saying if somebody was elected to Parliament in the colonies and went to Britain to serve, they still wouldn't be adequate representation because they would be so far removed from what the people actually wanted and needed. So things are going to start to get tense. After the Townshend Act, after the Massachusetts Circular Letter, Britain is going to send in some additional British troops. Specifically, you're going to see a lot of troops being sent into New England because that's going to be kind of a hotbed of political activity. That's where you're going to see a lot of people really angry about these taxes. And it makes sense because the taxes are going to hit places that are more manufacturing driven than places that grow things. Places that grow things are generally selling things to Great Britain. And there's a lot of import happening in New England. They rely pretty heavily on Great Britain. So one of the big things that's going to happen as a result of all of these new soldiers coming in is there's a lot of tension. Soldiers are being quartered, and meaning that they're being kind of forced into people's home. There's just a lot going on. Everybody's pretty mad, and it's going to come to a head with the Boston Massacre when the British soldiers fire on a crowd, killing or wounding 11. Now we are actually going to do an activity called CSI Boston Massacre, and that is going to give you some more information about the Boston Massacre, and you're going to decide for yourself what you think happened by reading primary sources. In response, though, to the Boston Massacre, you're going to see the formation of the Committees of Correspondence. Our good friend Sam Adams makes another appearance. You guys, you can't see that at all. Here, Sam Adams. He's here again. So you know that some pot stirring is about to happen. Now, what you're going to see after the Boston Massacre is a period of relative peace. And there's a reason for that. Generally, after something big like that happens, after there's like this huge explosion of violence, people reflect. And they're like, oh no, that could have been terrible. It could have been worse than it actually was. And so people kind of calm down a little bit. The tensions sort of lower. And so Sam starts the Committees of Correspondence as an interchange of letters to spread propaganda and keep British opposition alive. Basically, he's like, remember that we're mad, you guys. And so a couple years later, the British are going to pass the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is the thing that is generally seen as like the catalyst for the American Revolution. The Tea Act is going to, according to popular memory, it's going to charge us all this money for tea, and everybody loves tea. Everybody knows that the British love tea. We were British at the time. We love our tea. You're trying to take our tea away from us. You're trying to charge us so much money for this tea. And it's kind of a collective thing that everybody just thinks that that's what happened. We were mad because we were being charged so much for the tea. Now, the Tea Act is going to grant a company called the British East India Company a monopoly on tea, meaning that we can only get tea from the British East India Company. This is technically legislation because it was designed to help regulate the empire by ensuring that India, a British colony, their tea industry didn't go under, and ensuring that the colonists were getting tea at a fairer price, because tea was actually cheaper under the Tea Act. It was so cheap that it was cheaper to buy it from the British East India Company than to have it smuggled in. Now, some people are going to be mad because it's going to be the wrong kind of tea. Like, some of it was green tea. We didn't like green tea. Some of it was just not what we wanted. But also, it's just kind of the principle of the thing at this point. We don't want to be limited to getting tea from one place. You're messing with our rights. So you get the Boston Tea Party, and this is probably one of the most widely recognized events in American history. So what happens is Sons of Liberty, again, our good friend Sam Adams, he's there, they dress as Native Americans, and they dump 342 chests of tea into the harbor. So let's take a look real quick at kind of what that means, because when I was little, I thought that tea at the time was in tea bags and that they just kind of dumped it into the harbor. Now, I never thought that the harbor turned into tea, because I've talked to people who thought that the harbor literally just turned into tea. That's not what happened. But so I thought that they just kind of like ran on, and tea bags aren't super heavy, so I thought they just kind of came, dumped some stuff, and they ran, and so nobody could catch them. No, you guys, these chests of tea had tea bricks in them. So you can see in that picture on the right, these tea bricks, they are densely packed, they're heavy, they're big, and they were packed into some pretty big chests. So this took a long time, and nobody intervened. Why? They were scared of these guys. And so at the end of all of this, Britain has finally had enough. And they are going to pass the Intolerable Acts. Now, these Intolerable Acts are specifically designed to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. All of the acts prior to the Intolerable Acts can be seen as methods of either regulating the empire or at least trying to make money from the colonies. This was all about punishment. It closed the Boston Harbor, it revoked the Massachusetts Charter, it enforced quartering from the Quartering Act, and so we were livid. We were not allowed to govern ourselves anymore. We couldn't make money because the Boston Harbor was closed. We had British soldiers living in our houses. We're upset, to say the least. Now, again, this is going to impact New England a lot more, specifically Massachusetts, a lot more than other places, and that's going to be important later on. But you're going to see a couple of big reactions. First is the Suffolk Resolves, and the Suffolk Resolves come together and they agree to end all trade with Great Britain. So remember back to the Virginia Resolves, that was non-importation. The Suffolk Resolves are all trade. So we're not going to import, but we're also not going to export to Britain. And that's going to be made official at the First Continental Congress, where we also are going to draft the Declaration and Resolves. Now, 2 out of 13 of the colonies are going to be present, and if you want to make a guess about who wasn't there, you can go ahead and do that. I'll tell you, it was Georgia. It's always Georgia, you guys. We're terrible. So Georgia is not there. They are going to have their own little assembly. They actually weren't in session at the time of the First Continental Congress. It was a whole thing. But everybody's pretty upset about these Intolerable Acts, and they kind of make a step toward conflict with this Declaration and Resolves. It's basically telling Britain, here's what's going to happen if you don't start listening to us. So the Declaration of Rights and Grievances from the Stamp Act Congress was kind of a list of, here's the things that we feel like you're doing to harm us. Here's what legislation is, what taxation is, and here's why taxation isn't okay. The Declaration and Resolves is more, we are resolved to act if you don't start acting right. And that's going to coalesce into violence with Lexington and Concord. This is often referred to as the shot heard around the world. What ends up happening, since the Massachusetts Charter has been revoked with the Intolerable Acts, they actually send a British royal governor. His name is General Gage. He comes in, and one of the first things that he's going to do is send troops to arrest Sam Adams and a guy named John Hancock, as well as seize gunpowder from the colonial militia. All right, you guys, here's something that's really important, this seizing of gunpowder. Now, I don't think any of us can really blame General Gage for saying, hey, I want to put down this rebellion. Let me go ahead and arrest Sam Adams. We've seen he's everywhere. He's everywhere that there's any sort of conflict, and he's stirring the pot. So, like, from General Gage's perspective, you can definitely see why he might be like, okay, let's go ahead and make sure that this guy is out of the way. The big thing here is the gunpowder, because when we talk today about Second Amendment rights, whether or not you should be able to have a gun, whether we should be able to make laws restricting people from having guns, things like that, one of the big arguments that you hear, and I don't really care which side of this argument you're on, that sounds mean. What I mean is, for our purposes, it doesn't really matter which side you're on for you to understand this. One of the big arguments that you'll see from people regarding gun rights is that the first thing that a tyrannical government is going to do is take your guns. Now, the counter to that is the government has nukes. So even if you had your guns, what good would they do, right? So that's kind of a today sort of question. It's a contemporary issue. But I can tell you, historically speaking, one of the first things that Britain did, our tyrannical government, right, was they sent in people to try to seize gunpowder. Gunpowder was what made the guns fire. So yeah, the tyrannical government will come in and take guns. We have historical precedent for it. Now, after all of this happens, after Lexington and Concord, so Lexington and Concord is going to result in this kind of battle, skirmish sort of deal. The United States, we're not in the United States yet. The colonies, they kind of hold their own. It's not really a decisive win, but we don't really lose either, which is really important. So we fight a little bit. There's not really any sort of like reconciliation. There's not a big winner, so we're just kind of still mad. There's still a lot of tension, so we have another meeting. Now, all 13 colonies are going to be present at the Second Continental Congress, but it is important for you to understand that they were still not interested in independence. This was not something that we were bringing up yet. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence, and we're going to talk about when that kind of becomes an idea in just a couple minutes. So the Second Continental Congress is going to demand a redress of colonial grievances and declare war in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. The Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms basically says, hey, we're going to fight a war. We are declaring war on you. George Washington is in charge. Those are the big things that this declaration does. Now, moderates in the Continental Congress are also going to write the Olive Branch Petition. Georgia is actually really supportive of the Olive Branch Petition. And what it does is it writes directly to the king instead of to Parliament, and it says that colonists would remain loyal to the crown and end the war if their grievances were just addressed. So this is kind of trying to mediate instead of fight. But the fighting ends up happening anyway. The Olive Branch Petition is unsuccessful. The king doesn't even acknowledge it because he feels like acknowledging it would acknowledge governing power in the colonies. And so we fight the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. This is essentially the start of the Revolution. Lexington and Concord happens before the official declaring of war. And this is fought atop Breed's Hill. It's kind of been misnamed throughout history. This is the bloodiest battle of the war, and there's a really good reason for that. So this particular battle, since it's fought at the top of a hill, we have our colonists up here, we have the British counterparts down here. And so they have to go up the hill to be able to get to the Americans. This is going to give the Americans a significant advantage. Now, eventually, because the British are coming from the sea and they can just kind of send a bunch of troops in, eventually the Americans are going to have to retreat. They run out of ammo and gunpowder. But it is at great loss to the British, who are just kind of picked off as they try to run up this hill. After this, the British are going to proclaim the colonies to be officially in rebellion. So there are going to be two groups within America, within colonial America at the time. Now, obviously, our biggest adversary is the British soldiers. But something that we have a tendency to forget is that not everybody in the colonies was on the same side. When we talk about the Civil War, people tend to think of it as brother against brother because it was Americans versus Americans, right? But you had Americans versus Americans in this war as well, and it really was a war that pitted literal brother against brother because the divisions within the colonies were based on their political opinions, whether or not they thought that the colonies should be fighting this war, and later on, whether or not they thought that declaring independence was a good idea. So you're going to get two groups within the colonies, the Loyalists, also called the Tories, and the Patriots, also called the Whigs. Now usually I refer to them as the Loyalists and the Patriots because I feel like if there is an easier name for something, that's the name that we should use. And Loyalists says right in there that they are loyal. Who are they loyal to? The British. And then of course you've got the Patriots, and if anybody's ever seen The Patriot, you kind of know who the Patriots are, right? So there are some differences between the people who generally are going to be loyalists and the people who generally are going to be patriots. Now, this is not a definite. It's not like all people who had the traits of the loyalists were loyalists. But generally speaking, loyalists for the most part were conservative, they were educated, they were wealthy, and they were older. The patriots, on the other hand, were usually liberal, uneducated, lower class, and young. So why? Why this difference? Why is it kind of these people are diametrically opposed to one another? Conservative, we've kind of changed the terms conservative and liberal to basically mean Republican and Democrat, but that's not an adequate or accurate definition. Conservative means basically that you want to conserve, right? You want things to stay the same. Liberal is all about change. And so people who don't want change to happen are tending to be loyal to the British Crown. People who are all about change and all about reform are going to want to reform things. They'll be patriots. You've also got the educated and the wealthy versus the uneducated and the lower class. Now, usually these two factors come kind of hand in hand. It's not often that somebody who starts out poor ends up being educated. Alexander Hamilton is a great anomaly. A lot of the time, if you are from a lower class, you don't have the money to educate yourself. So if you are educated and you are wealthy, it means that things are going well for you, right? It means that your family has some good standing, you got some money, you have the ability to be educated. And so just as a general rule, you're happy with the way things are. You don't want to change the status quo because the status quo has been good to you. The other big one is the older generation versus the younger generation. And this one is really interesting to me because you see it a lot even today, the idea that older people tend to be more conservative. Older people also tend to not want things to change. Like they're very, very reluctant to use new technologies. Like my mom, for example, before she passed away, until the day that she passed away, had a flip phone, you guys. She only died a couple years ago, so we were very well outside of the realm of flip phone by that point. But she didn't like smartphones. She didn't want to change. I actually tried to get her, I think it was like a Samsung S7 or something like that. It was something that had Google on it, so that she could use Google Voice. And so I got it for her, and I was like, look, Mom, because my mom, she was mostly blind because of some of the illnesses that she had. So I was like, look, Mom, I got you this so that you can text, because she loved to call me in the middle of class. So I was like, you can just text me so that you'll know whether I'm in class. I can just respond to you. It'll read it to you. You'll be able to hear it. It'll be great. You can ask questions. You can Google questions. And she was very inquisitive. She was highly, highly educated. And so not being able to see was really frustrating for her. So like, you can do all this stuff with your phone. It'll be great. And she lasted like 2 days. And she called me and she was like, the Google won't listen to me. She ended up giving the phone away because she was just so frustrated with this new technology, because it wouldn't listen to her. So a lot of the time you are going to see that the older generation is just resistant to new things. So the next thing I want to talk about is the shift to independence. Now remember, the beginning of the American Revolution, we're not actually trying to become independents. We just want our grievances addressed. We just want to fix what we think was wrong, right? We're all about changing the status quo, making things better for us. But eventually we're going to get to the idea of forming a new country. And a lot of this is going to be centered around the way the war is going. The war isn't really going well at the beginning. It looks like we might lose. And so as we get further and further into this war, people are going to kind of be less inclined to fight in it. We're going to have more and more trouble getting patriots on our side. More people are going to defect and be loyalists. And a lot of the undecided people are going to start to decide that they would rather be loyal to the crown because things aren't looking great. And if people's only reason for fighting a war is because they want things to get better and the war is terrible and it's making things worse, they'll only fight it for so long. And so once we shift to the idea of independence and we talk about forming a new country, we give people a renewed interest in the war. We kind of reinvigorate the war effort. A lot of the war effort is going to center around some ideas of the Enlightenment. So this period focuses on rational thinking, progress, and the ideas of liberty. Now, there are three major Enlightenment thinkers that are going to have a profound impact on this time period, and on this shift to independence. One of those is a guy named John Locke. Now, John Locke is going to say that people created the government to protect their natural rights. Those natural rights are life, liberty, and property. You might have heard in the Declaration of Independence the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson is basically one of the first American plagiarists. He took that and changed it a little bit from John Locke. There's another guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a French Enlightenment thinker who said that the government is formed by the people. Those people give up some of their rights in the interest of the general will of the majority. But in giving up those rights for the general will, it means that the general will of the majority has to be satisfied. And so if most people want their rights to be given to them, if most people are agitating for change, then that change should happen. Finally, we've got Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is an American who writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. This is propaganda. It is all about changing and swaying people's opinions, and it's all in favor of independence. We put all of these together. All of these guys are going to influence people's ideas, people's notions, and it's going to result in the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence itself is proposed by a guy named Richard Henry Lee in June of 1776. Now, it's written predominantly by Thomas Jefferson. He did have people helping him, but he's the guy we generally remember for it. By the end of June, Jefferson had what was known as a fair copy. This is basically his draft. It was read in Congress, debated, and revised. There were actually a lot of things taken out of the original Declaration of Independence. One of the major passages that was removed was all about slavery, and it was removed because the North and the South couldn't agree on our status, on our stance on slavery. But he says in the original Declaration of Independence, he, being the king, has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. So he's talking about how it's basically the king's fault that slavery is a thing. And the South doesn't want to recognize this because they don't want to talk about how it's a deplorable thing. To them, it's cool. Slavery is fine. So they don't want to acknowledge this. But that original copy of the Declaration of Independence did have a tirade by Thomas Jefferson, who incidentally was also a slaveholder, in it. Now, independence is actually declared on July 2nd, 1776, and it's adopted on July 4th, which is why we celebrate Independence Day then. So let's talk about a couple of the major battles. Now, we're not going to talk about everything, not at all. We're going to talk about some of the biggest things that are going on within the war, and some of the ones that have a profound influence on how the war goes. So, first major one after the Battle of Bunker Hill that I want to talk about is the Battle of Trenton. Now, this is the one, if you've ever seen that picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, that's where that comes from. The Battle of Trenton was when Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware on Christmas night to fight Hessian mercenaries the next day. Now, this was a fairly unique thing at the time because Christmas was something that was generally celebrated, and ceasefires more often than not were called. All the way through, even like World War I, there was an instance in trench warfare where you had I think it was the French and the Germans, they were on either side in the trenches, and for Christmas they call a ceasefire, and they actually are going to eat together and play soccer in the middle of the trenches, and then the next day they just resume killing each other. So it's generally assumed that you weren't going to fight on Christmas, that there wouldn't be troop movements. So Washington's going to be real sneaky. He's going to move his troops on Christmas night, and while the Hessians, these mercenaries, are still kind of, hung over from Christmas the day before, they're going to attack. This is going to be really important because it's going to kind of change the trajectory of the war. Now, in September and October of 1777, you're going to see arguably one of the most important battles in American history. And this is the Battle of Saratoga. In the Battle of Saratoga, the British are going to try to capture New England. The reason that this is important is, remember, New England was that hotbed of political activity. And so it was still that way during the Revolution. The South, especially, was much more reticent to participate in the revolution. Now, they were participating, but they weren't as gung-ho about it. And so the British thought if they could cut New England off, if they could capture New England and get them under control, the South would just kind of fall in line. Now, this ended up being one of history's most decisive battles. Now, that doesn't mean that the Americans won spectacularly. What decisive means, is that it decides the course of history. The American win at the Battle of Saratoga is hugely important because it's going to inspire French aid. The French are going to start openly helping the Americans, and this is actually going to be hugely, hugely important to the war effort. It turns the tide of the war, and arguably we wouldn't have been able to win it without French aid. For example, when we talk about the Battle of Yorktown, the French are going to be the kind of driving force. They're going to be the deciding factor in that battle, and that battle ends the Revolution. Now, from 1777 to 1778, the winter kind of that, so towards the end of the year to the beginning of 1778, soldiers are going to spend their time at Valley Forge. Valley Forge is rough, you guys. This isn't technically a battle, but it's where they spend their winter. They have very, very few supplies, very little food. People are not doing well. Soldiers are starting to defect. Morale is at an all-time low. French aid doesn't become official until February of 1778. And so that winter before that's official, and before we start getting money from the French, is really hard for American soldiers. And one of the main reasons that we're actually able to make it through that time period is because of a guy named Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a Frenchman who had money and used his own money, his own power, his own influence to help the Americans. Now, something that's not actually on the trajectory of the war that I do want to talk about is something called the Battle of Kettle Creek. The Battle of Kettle Creek happens in February of 1779. The reason that it's important isn't because it's hugely important as far as the war overall, but it is one of the major battles that you're going to see in Georgia. So there's the battle for Kettle Creek, and there's a siege in Savannah. Now, Kettle Creek isn't a huge battle. It's kind of minor, but the results of Kettle Creek are going to ensure that the status quo kind of remains in Georgia. The royal governor, had actually been kicked out when the colonies declared independence. The royal governor, after Kettle Creek and the siege of Savannah, is going to come back and try to take over. So you've got that happening in 1779. The war is going to end by 1781 with the Battle of Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown happens because what happens in it is the Americans pin the British on three sides. So let's just so you've got the British are right here. The Americans are coming in from three different sides. And then there's water over here. Now, something that the British were notorious for is they would escape by sea. This happens a ton of times throughout the American Revolution. It's one of the reasons that major battles are going to have kind of long periods in between them, because a lot of the time these troops, they would just leave. And they would come back, they would regroup, and they would fight again. So even if a battle didn't go well, they could go home, they could regroup, they could send more soldiers. So that's what they were trying to do with the Battle of Yorktown. The French are going to have a profound impact on this, specifically the Marquis de Lafayette. Alexander Hamilton is also going to play a huge role in this. And so what's going to happen is General Cornwallis, the guy in charge of the British, is going to try to escape by sea. But the French, that's their boat. Excellent artist, right? So the French are going to cut off their escape, and that is ultimately going to end the war. Now, the war ends here, but we don't get the Treaty of Paris until 1783. But that is going to formally recognize American independence, ending the Revolutionary period.